There we go. All right, hello everyone, and welcome to our first session of the 2024 Volunteer Engagement Series. My name is Sydney Enns. Different from last year, many of you know me as Sydney Shutro. Recently got married, so I'm confusing everyone with having my old name still as my email address, but my title being different. So just call me Sydney, and it'll all work out. And I'm the Director of Volunteer Engagement at the Tennessee Commission on Aging and Disability. We're celebrating our 5th year of this series, which is an extremely exciting milestone. So thank you all who are joining for the first time and everyone who's been with me since the beginning to support volunteer engagement across the Aging Network and beyond. For everyone new to the series, we have all the presentations from January 2020 posted to our YouTube channel. And by the end of the day tomorrow, I'll have this presentation posted along with a follow-up email with any session resources for everyone who registered. I do want to do my typical disclaimer that these webinars are being recorded, so please be sure to keep information confidential when talking about volunteers, clients, and partners in the community. Be sure to put yourself on mute to reduce the background noise for our speakers. And now is also the time if you want to turn off your camera to not have your face recorded, totally up to you. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type those into the chat box and we'll address them as quickly as we can. And we also encourage you to use the reactions function to give the presenter some feedback throughout the presentation and stay engaged in the discussion. It's important to remember that everything we talk about on these webinars is not a requirement for you to implement in your programs. These are simply best practices through research and experiences. However, if you do like what you hear and you want to implement a suggestion or strategy, be sure to have the support of your supervisor or management before moving forward. Before I introduce our guest speaker today, I'm excited to have Lauren Legate with us for a few minutes this morning. As most of you know, TCAD and the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities will be merging together to form a new department once legislation is passed. Lauren is the Chief of Staff at the Department of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities and has been an instrumental support in TCAD and the efforts of the Aging Network across the state. Lauren, I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself to the group, and thank you so much for being with us.
Hi, everyone. It is wonderful to be with you all today. I hope everyone is staying safe and staying warm. I was very excited for this afternoon because as much as I love my family, I'm anxious to be around and to visit with people that I'm not related to. It's been a long week here being stuck inside. So happy to be here. As Sydney mentioned, I am Chief of Staff for DIDD. I serve under Commissioner Turner. We are both so excited about this merger. Sydney mentioned it is being filed from the governor's office this session, and if it passes, this will become a reality July 1st. This is something that we've done with prior programs to bring them on to the DIDD family, and so throughout this 6 months, we'll do a lot of preparing, a lot of learning, a lot of getting out across the state, getting to know you and what you do and how you serve older Tennesseans. Commissioner Turner and I have already started visiting AAADs. We were supposed to be in East Tennessee this week, but of course we had to postpone that. But we're anxious to get out and get started. So is our executive leadership team. TCAD is not coming under us. TCAD is joining us, and the mission of serving older Tennesseans is going to be priority number one for us as we get into this space. So like I mentioned, that means a lot of learning and a lot of finding out, what the emerging concerns are. We've already been working on our list, and we're just anxious to get out across the state. So that being said, thank you for what you do. Thank you for the impact you make. It's obvious that so many things couldn't happen without what you do. So I'm glad to learn from you and to get to know you a little bit more over the coming months. And I'm glad to be here today to learn more about the ethics part of it. I think that's a great topic. Something we could always learn more about. So Sydney, I think that's about it. I know we don't have real time for questions, but thank you again for having me. I'll maybe drop my email in the chat if you have any questions or you'd like to reach out directly, or if you have something maybe any interest for us to come out and visit you and learn more about what you do. We would love that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. We're excited to see what the future has in store. And now on to the main event. Faiza, feel free to share your screen. I believe you have that function. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, Sydney, give me 1 second. Let me get it shared with you. Can you let me know if you could see my screen, Sydney?
Can't see it just yet.
Okay, give me 1 second here. How about now?
There we go.
All right.
Awesome.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Faiza Venzant. I'm so excited to be joining you. And I feel bad to say this, but I am joining you from sunny Southern California. I live in Temecula, California, which is just north of San Diego and south of LA. But I lived in Canada for 43 years of my life. So I empathize with all of you who are snowed in or iced in, and just know that it will be over soon. So we're here today to talk about understanding the role of ethics in volunteer engagement and management. And I'm coming to you on behalf of the Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration. And I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. So I think if you aren't muted, if you can just go ahead and mute yourself, that'll really help with that feedback. So it's also not recorded as part of the recording. So I wanted to say a big thank you to my colleague, Sydney, who is a CVA, which means Certified in Volunteer Administration. I'm also a CVA, and the Council for Certification in Administration has been the home of the CVA credential and also the home of our professional ethics for many years. And I want to say kudos to you, Sydney, for bringing this topic, bringing this topic to today's webinar, because it's not a subject that we talk about or that we focus on very often. Usually it happens when there's an ethical dilemma or when there's a breach of ethics. But building your confidence in dealing with ethical dilemmas, it happens, it's like a muscle that you get to exercise. So the more you think about it, even though you may not have an ethical dilemma happening to you right now, the more you think about it and have it top of mind, the more confident you'll be and the better you'll be able to respond when you do come across an ethical dilemma. So a couple housekeeping things. We're going to move through this material pretty quickly. This is a 2-hour workshop that we've pared down to under an hour. And if you ever feel like you need a refresher or you want to spend a bit more time with this material, we do offer ethics workshops regularly at CVA. And you can sign up for an additional one or recommend our workshops to someone. Our website is cvacert.org/ethics. Sydney will also share with you the slides from today's session, as well as 2 handouts that I'm going to be talking about as we go through the session. All of this is also available on the CVA website, which is on this title slide. So I'm going to start off by talking to you a little bit about a colleague. Her name is not really Lynn. We've changed her name for this webinar, but this is a real case study that happened to a colleague of ours, also a CVA. So Lynn is the director of volunteer services at a hospital, and Lynn's been asked by senior management to organize a COVID-19 vaccination clinic for volunteers based on her government's current phasing criteria. This is a case study from the summer of 2021. And at that time, vaccination supply was not guaranteed. So while determining which volunteers meet the current age and medical criteria, Lynn is approached by the Vice President of Development, and he instructs her to invite one of the hospital's largest donors, Mrs. Smith, to be vaccinated. So when Lynn comments that the clinic is for current volunteers, the VP says that Mrs. Smith has dedicated lots of time and causes, lots of time to causes on behalf of the hospital before, and that, we really can't afford to disappoint her. Lynn knows that Mrs. Smith doesn't meet the current age requirement for vaccination and is unsure of her medical background. What do you think Lynn should do? I want you to just think of Lynn's example as we go through the material today. We'll revisit it at the end, and I'll take you through how Lynn used the tools that we'll be talking about today to come to a decision for herself. And hopefully that will help to animate the information that we'll be going through. So keep Lynn in mind as we start to learn about the professional ethics in volunteer administration. So first, a bit of background and a little bit of context for this topic. Ethics is something that has been written about and talked about for centuries, but it's only been in the last 50 years or so that we have connected the idea of ethics and volunteer administration. Ethics is one of the defining characteristics of any profession, and you'll know from working with like doctors or lawyers or HR professionals that a lot of different professions have a code of ethics or an ethical framework by which they work. In the 1970s, the first statement of ethics in volunteer administration was developed, and that was developed by the Association for Volunteer Administration, which was known as AVA back in the time. And this was developed as a way for practitioners to signal to their colleagues that, we take this work as leaders of volunteers really seriously. In 2006, AVA had to dissolve, and so the ethics material was transferred to the newly formed Council for Certification in Volunteer Administration. AVA also administered the credential at that time, so the administration of the credential and the ethics were both transferred to the newly formed CCVA. In 2016, CCVA put together a task force. We took a look at the ethics again, just to ensure that they were still relevant and useful. And we have what are our values that we'll be talking about today. If you are a CVA, and I see a few of you in the audience today, I just wanted to say hello. You'll know as a CVA that when you sign on to become a CVA, you do have to affirm your commitment to professional ethics. And then every 5 years, when you renew your certification in volunteer administration, you reaffirm your ethics again every 5 years. And that just shows our commitment as professionals to our profession and to the ethics in service of all of the communities that we work with and that we recruit volunteers on behalf of. So also to keep in mind is that even though CCVA is the home of the professional ethics and volunteer administration, we don't apply and we don't play an enforcer role, right? So nobody's going to call you tomorrow and say, hey, I heard you had an ethical dilemma and you didn't handle it right. There's a punishment for you to pay. That's not the role that we have. Really, what we want to do by providing webinars like we're doing today and resources for you is we want to help to build your confidence and your courage when it comes to dealing with ethical dilemmas in the workplace, especially because so much of the work that you do involves community members and oftentimes people who are part of under-prioritized communities. So let's think about the word ethics, okay? How would you define it? For me, it's something that I know what I mean when I say it, but sometimes it can be hard to describe what it is. There's a lot of different words that sometimes we can interchange with the idea of ethics. And you'll see some of those on the screens. Some of the words are more useful when we're thinking about individual values and beliefs, for example, or morals are more associated with individuals. And then values is one of those ones that can straddle both the individual and community or group or organizational behaviors. So things like values, policies, and cultures are more so what we would use to describe ethics as applicable to organizations or groups. Now, all of these terms represent important concepts and also rules that we can't ignore when we're working together, and especially when we're working in partnership with communities or on behalf of people who've been under-prioritized. They might mean different things to different people, and sometimes that can feel confusing, it can be overwhelming, and it can be really tricky when it comes down to the practical application of ethics. And so let's start with a really simple idea that I hope all of us can understand. I want you to think about your ethics as a backpack that you carry around, okay? For me, I like a crossbody bag. It might be a briefcase for you, a clutch, whatever it is, whatever you carry, think of it as carrying your ethics in some sort of backpack, okay? Your ethics backpack is going to be part of who you are. It's going to be deeply personal and unique to you, and mine is going to be the same for me. And so we might have some of the same contents in our backpack, but we're also going to have different things in our backpack. And that's good. That's something that we need to acknowledge, especially when it comes to an ethical dilemma. We can never assume that what is in someone else's backpack is going to be the same as ours. So that's something to really keep in mind. So when you open up your backpack, what exactly is in there, right? Let's take a look at that more closely. I want to start with personal ethics, okay? In your backpack is going to be your personal ethics, and they are just that. They are yours. They're very subjective, and they're based on your lived experience, your personal experiences, your values and your principles. They may also be influenced by a faith if you practice any sort of faith, um, your ethnicity. They could be influenced by the birth order you are in your family. All kinds of things make your personal ethics yours. Your personal ethics are what guides your immediate reaction to a situation. Okay. So there's an internal voice sometimes that goes off. For some of us, there's like a physical cue. Like for me, it's like a pit feeling in my stomach. For other people, it could mean breaking out into a sweat or your cheeks getting really flushed. There is this immediate reaction that happens to a situation, which is usually your personal ethics being challenged, or something is not meshing or jiving with your personal ethics. Now, because of this, doing the right thing is going to mean something different to you than it might mean to somebody else. And can definitely happen in a neighborhood, in a community, in a workplace, or where you volunteer. Next in your backpack are your organizational ethics. Okay, so your organizational ethics are like a set of principles that are there to govern how people will behave and act. And sometimes these are called a code of ethics, sometimes it's called our guiding values. Your organization might have a mission, vision, and values, for example. The purpose of it is to make sure that there's consistency of action amongst anybody that's um, doing business or providing a service on behalf of that organization, rather than leaving it up to every person to move guided by their own personal ethics. Okay. So, when we have volunteers join us in our organization, sometimes we ask them to sign off on what our ethics or our values are. That's what we're talking about. You may have these on your website, you may have these printed on your business card, for example. I encourage you, when this webinar is over, is to take a look at your organizational ethics or values and see how consistent they are with maybe your personal values, and then also what we're going to be talking about next, which is the professional ethics. Okay, so professional ethics are principles and values that apply to a specific field of activity, and it doesn't matter the context, it's about the field of activity. So for example, you might be a leader of volunteers that works in a performing arts center. You may work in a nursing facility. You may work in a food pantry. Your ethics when it comes to working with volunteers are going to be the same regardless of the landscape. So this is similar to, for example, doctors, right? Whether they work in a free clinic, a for-profit clinic, whether it's a hospital setting or Doctors Without Borders, those medical ethics are going to be the same regardless of what the context is. So with all of these in our backpack, right, it's no wonder that sometimes it can feel confusing. Sometimes there's going to be conflict, and we are forced to decide sometimes, which one of my ethics am I going to honor and which ones am I okay having to deny in order to move forward in a situation. Hopefully there's a lot of overlap between your personal, your organizational, and professional ethics, but sometimes that's not always the case. Okay. And this is why ethical dilemmas occur. This is why they're so hard to navigate. One of the things I want to say here is that, when you think about that, one of the reasons why they can be so hard to navigate as well is that it's likely that when you're thinking through an ethical dilemma, there's somebody who's going to be disappointed at the end of the day in the final decision that is made. And I say that to say that because we all have different personal ethics, we're going to look at a situation differently. We may come up with solutions. I may come up with some solutions that you may not come up with just based on what my personal experience is. All that to say that there is no perfect answer when it comes to solving an ethical dilemma, but there are some great tools that you can use. There are some defensible decisions that you can make when you're going about this work. So now that we understand what the three types of ethics are in our backpack, I want to look a little more closely at what those ethics and what those values are. So this slide shows you the 5 core values of volunteer engagement professionals. They are citizenship, respect, accountability, fairness, and trust. I like to think of the word craft. I like to think of what we do as our craft, and that helps me to remember the CRAFT, what those stands for. So you might be wondering, where did they come from? Where did we come up with these 5 words? So years ago, the very well-known Josephson Institute on Ethics conducted some extensive research, leading to the conclusion that all kinds of people everywhere agree on a core set of values, and that's sort of what you're seeing in front of you right now. A lot of that research formed the basis for many professions and the values that they have. So if you were to look at our values and you're about to look at the values for a lot of other professions, you're going to see a ton of overlap because um, uh, many of us looked to the work of the Josephson Institute when our professions were creating ethics and values for us. Um, so the next few slides are going to provide a few more details on each of these ethical core values. Sydney is also going to share with you a one-page handout that lists all of these values. So just listen in. You don't have to scribble anything down or write. You're going to get all of this sent to you after the session. So let's start with citizenship. So this value, what this means is that, we as leaders of volunteers, we understand that volunteerism is the foundation of civil society. It guides, and what that means is that volunteerism also guides our organizations and its stakeholders towards an environment of active community participation. We have to actually intentionally say as organizations that we value volunteers, and then to open our doors to create policies and procedures that allow for this to happen. That's this idea of citizenship and this adoption of active community participation. Now, every value is informed by 3 principles. And when it comes to citizenship, citizenship is informed by, first, a philosophy of volunteerism. And what that means is that as a leader of volunteers, you have a clear personal philosophy on volunteerism and that you support your organization to develop one of their own. Okay. So as a leader of volunteers, if you have not had a chance to really think about what is your personal philosophy on volunteerism, I encourage you to do that, because when you can stand confident in what that is, and when you're really clear on what that is, you can play a role in guiding your organization to also develop a philosophy around volunteer participation or community participation. Next is social responsibility. And this principle means that as leaders of volunteers, we have a responsibility to make sure that we facilitate a compassionate and a caring environment and culture where community needs are met and shared values are enhanced when we have volunteers that are involved. This is really important because this centers communities in the work that we do. And when we have this principle of social responsibility, it means that regardless of what the organization stands for, regardless of what our targets are as leaders of volunteers, number of volunteers or number of volunteer hours, what's most important is the impact that we have on the communities that we are going to be serving. Okay, and this is that social responsibility that we have. So as leaders of volunteers, we also really need to be aware of not only what is our responsibility as an employee of an organization, or for those of you who may be leading volunteers in a volunteer capacity, what is also your responsibility in connecting the volunteers that you recruit and that you involve, in terms of how they're connected to the impact they're making in the community that they are there to serve, right? They're there to serve the community before they're there to serve the organization. And we should be really clear on that. Lastly is the principle of philanthropy, okay? When we're thinking about philanthropy, what that means is that we as leaders of volunteers, we cultivate and we also model what it is to be generous with spirit and with time and with resources to ensure that volunteers have what they need to be able to serve the community and to be able to meet the needs of the community. So next value that we're going to talk about is respect. And what this means is that as leaders of volunteers, we know that every single person has inherent value, has skills and abilities that they can offer up. And what we know is that when somebody comes to our organization to offer a hand, offer time or talent or treasure, that there's a mutual benefit that's gained between that volunteer and that organization, and also the community that's going to be receiving that help, or whatever the mission is of that organization. So the principles of dignity, inclusivity, and privacy are what informs this idea of respect. So dignity means we act in a compassionate manner. We uphold the right of all volunteers to be valued and not just valued, but involved in decisions that affect them. Okay. This is something that I didn't learn until much later in my career. I'm in my 25th year leading volunteers. It took me a while to really understand the value of involving volunteers in decisions that affected them. So simple things like data migration, right? Changing a database procedure, or creating new volunteer roles, or changing messaging on our website, involving volunteers and also the community that I serve in those processes to make sure that I'm creating processes that are not just easier for me, but will also help the volunteers to do what they need to do more efficiently or more easily or in a more compassionate way, but also in a way that helps us to see our community members from an asset-based perspective rather than what they're lacking. Okay, or rather than the resource that they're seeking from our organization. That's that idea of dignity. Next is the idea of inclusivity, which is so relevant today when we're talking about dimensions of diversity and trying to build more diverse and inclusive volunteer bases. And as leaders of volunteers, we are doing our best. For some of us, this is work that we are really good at. For a lot of us, this is new work that we're trying to think about. And here we're thinking about encouraging and facilitating the participation of community members of diverse backgrounds, diverse perspectives, and diverse abilities. So relevant for today. And then lastly is privacy. And this means, protecting the privacy of our volunteers and any information that they consider to be confidential. And I'm not talking just about the contact information they give you, like their phone number or their address or their email address. This is also about when you work so closely with people, especially in organizations where you're working with a very underprioritized community, and there can be discussions of trauma involved, intense levels of training. This also means holding the privacy of stories that are shared with you by volunteers near and dear to your heart, right? I've been really lucky in the last 25 years that volunteers have shared with me when they're going to be proposing to a partner. I've had volunteers share a cancer diagnosis with me before they were ready to share it with their family. And those are also things that I hold really dear and private and confidential as well. And that's that principle of privacy and how it relates to this value of respect. I'm going to stop for 1 second. And Sydney, I can't see the teams as well as my slides at the same time. Are there any questions or comments right now before I move on?
Not yet. Your the presentation isn't exactly centered, like you shared it, but it's cutting off a little bit on the left side, like where your logo is.
Okay.
But luckily a lot of your slides are centered, so it was only kind of the beginning where it was the scenario that we could only read a little bit, or a little bit was cut off.
Okay, cool. I don't know what to do about that because on my screen it is centered. But let me know if just shout out if there's something that's cut off at some point, and then I can fill in the blanks.
Yeah, and like you've mentioned, you've sent me the slide deck, so everyone will be able to get these resources tomorrow, most likely.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sydney. Okay, so the next value is accountability, and this means that the administrator of volunteers demonstrates a responsibility not just to the organization and its stakeholders, and that includes staff, donors, volunteers, community members, clients, patients, but also to each other as a profession. As our profession of volunteer administration, we also have accountability to each other, because what I do in my workplace affects our reputation as a profession, and it indirectly can affect you down the line as well. So how do we do this? One is through the principle of collaboration, and that means that as leaders of volunteers, we include stakeholders in how we develop and support volunteer engagement in our organizations, and that we also kind of look for ways to cultivate partnerships to enhance the impact that our volunteers can make. Sometimes this can mean partnering with a similar organization and combining efforts of your volunteers, or reducing the duplication of efforts of volunteers. It could mean reaching out to an organization that provides training that would be beneficial to your volunteers, or offering training for another organization, for example. So finding ways to collaborate with each other is really important, and is in line with what our ethics are and our those values and principles. Next is this idea of continuous improvement, which is what you're demonstrating here today, right? It's pursuing excellence in your profession and as a leader of volunteers by enhancing your professional competence. So coming to a session like this today, networking with your peers. It could also, mean maintaining certifications, like getting your CVA or taking courses on leading volunteer engagement, or maybe you work in animal welfare and it's being certified in that field as well. But it's that continuous improvement and commitment to learning, and also fostering innovation, something that I was so proud of our profession during the pandemic. All the ways that leaders of volunteers found to keep checking in with volunteers, even if they had been shuttered for the time being or programming had stopped. There was so much innovation that was taking place, and that is that commitment to continuous improvement. And then lastly is professionalism, right? Providing outstanding service to your organization, to the people it serves, to the staff, the volunteers, and then, but doing that while upholding your personal and your professional boundaries as well. Then we move on to fairness. So fairness is about committing to individual and collective efforts that make sure that there is a fair and a just organizational culture, okay? And this again is so relevant to today. We do this through impartiality. So we do our best. We're all humans and we all have our biases. Some of them are unknown to us or unconscious. Some of them may be hidden, but we do our very best to remain unbiased and objective when we're working with whoever our stakeholders are. Equity refers to making sure we're doing whatever we can to ensure that there is equitable access to volunteer opportunities, to resources that we have, because for many of us, our volunteers are a resource that we are able to share with the community, right? And so making sure that there's equitable access, not only to be able to volunteer, but access to volunteers as well. And also to whatever support volunteers need, right? So if there are supports that are available, that volunteers have equitable access to those supports as well. Some of you have insurance for your volunteers, some of you have training, some of you have materials and swag and all of that kind of stuff as well. So making sure that's being distributed or made available in an equitable way. And then lastly, when we think about justice in terms of our ethics, another word that we hear so much about today, what that means is implementing open and consistent processes that help us to make sure that when we're making decisions, when we're building new plans, we're doing them in a way that addresses any discriminatory or prejudicial behaviors or outcomes. All right, so last is trust. So important, and one of those values that you're going to see amongst so many professions, which basically is that, as leaders of volunteers, we do our best to maintain loyal and trusting relationships, and we try to create safe environments based on established standards of practice. If you're not familiar with the standards of practice for our profession, I encourage you to go to the Association for Leaders in Volunteer Engagement in Canada. If we've got anyone, in the United States, their website is volunteeralive.org, and you can find the standards of practice there. In Canada, you can also find them on the PAVRO website, which is pavro.on.ca, pavro.on.ca, and there's standards of practice in both countries as they relate to engaging volunteers. So we do this very simply through honesty, right? Truth and transparency in the work that we do. Integrity, what we say and what we do are aligned. So we have consistency between our words and our actions, and we practice ethical decision making. That's one of the ways that we flex what it is to be have integrity in our principles. And then lastly is commitment, right? We act in a forthright manner with really good intent, sincere good intent, and we follow through on promises we've made and agreements that we've made as well. So I know this has been a super quick introduction to those 5 values and principles. And I know that many of these words are going to be familiar to you and they're not going to be surprising to you. This language also appears in so many other codes of ethics as well, which is a good thing. And here really it's just been tailored to the work that we do. So before we move into what is an ethical dilemma and how do what's the process for dealing with one of them, I want to just let you know that not every situation that you come across is going to be an ethical dilemma. Sometimes it's just an awful situation, it's a yucky situation, but that doesn't mean that it is an ethical dilemma. So, ethical dilemmas have very specific characteristics. Okay. When you're looking at the screen, there's a bunch of questions on here. And if you're answering yes to most of these, you most likely have an ethical dilemma. So these specific characteristics to our ethical dilemmas are first that an ethical dilemma is rooted in a very specific context or situation. If you have a situation that's coming up on a daily basis or keeps coming up over and over again, it's likely that that's not an ethical dilemma. There's probably a gap in your policy, a misunderstanding of procedure, an opportunity for retraining, or taking a look at what's missing from training that's going on. It's not an ethical dilemma if it's something that's happening all the time. Okay, so an ethical dilemma is really specific and really unusual. An ethical dilemma is a conflict that involves two or more values or principles. So, from those five values and the three principles that informed each of them, an ethical dilemma involves two of them. And there's a what I like to call like a rub or like a tension, and identified with at least two of those. Okay. An ethical dilemma involves the claims of multiple stakeholders. It's not just you grappling with a question with yourself. Okay. An ethical dilemma it involves multiple people. So you and perhaps a volunteer and a community member or a staff person, more than one person is involved. In an ethical dilemma, there's a policy that usually you would follow, but for some reason in the situation that's come up, the policy doesn't seem to be the right response. Okay. You can tell, you can say the policy says this, but it's not working for this situation. And there needs to be some flexibility. And I don't actually think the policy is right in this situation. So you might be having this kind of like, yeah, but, or I'm not comfortable with that. Those are the kinds of signals that are going off for you. And then lastly, when it comes to an ethical dilemma, there can be a downside to making a correct choice. And what that means is that because there are multiple stakeholders involved, because you sometimes don't have all the information that you need, there might be a downside to making a correct choice. And what you're trying to do is make the decision in the time that you have with the most amount of information you have, and to make a decision that causes the least harm. Okay. Sometimes the downside might be that it might not have been the thing you wanted to do. Sometimes the downside might be that you disappoint someone, but there's a downside to making that choice. All right. So you have an ethical dilemma. Think about Lynn, who's organizing this vaccine clinic, and we're going to go back to her in a second. But you have this ethical dilemma. And so there is a process that you can follow. This is a 5-step process. It is not unique to leaders of volunteers. You'll find this process explained in so many other professions as well when it comes to ethical decision making for their professions and in their work as well. It's a really helpful process for a few reasons. One is that when you go through this process, it helps to promote a fuller understanding of the situation. It also avoids any knee-jerk reactions, right? So it takes into account your personal ethics or biases. There's room for you to consider those, but also to put those aside. And it forces you to pause and to take time before just acting on what your personal bias might be. It also encourages some creative thinking and seeking multiple perspectives on your situation. It allows you to have a safe way to explore various different options. And I'm going to show you a tool that you can use to do that as well. And you can do that without causing harm to anybody or making a final decision. And then lastly, when you follow these steps and you've thought them through, it results in a defensible decision for you. So if you're questioned about your decision, you have a rational process that you can document and say, like, these are the steps that I took. And I'll tell you that in my 25 years in doing this work, I've never had to defend a decision because I've gone through this process. And when it comes to communicating my decision, I'm actually able to show why I reached the decision that I made as well. And then I don't need to also defend it. Okay. So when we are confronted with this ethical dilemma, we want to find the right answer. We want to make sure that we're doing the best that we can do. And the reality is that every situation is unique. And often the course of action that we will take may have some negative consequences. So Perfection is not going to be attainable when it comes to ethical decision making, but you can make a decision that you feel confident about, that is defensible, and that you can move forward about. So keep that in mind as well for anyone for which black and white is really important or perfection is really important. This is an area which might be a little bit uncomfortable for you, but that doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means, keep that in mind about yourself. All right. So when we're thinking about these decision-making steps, gathering information, at this stage, we are asking what led to this situation, who's involved in the situation, what is unique about it, what are the multiple perspectives that I need to understand, are there any relevant policies that are at play here, what don't I know, what else do I need to know? So you're gathering a ton of information. This step right here is where your personal biases get checked and it avoids you making a knee-jerk reaction because you have to slow down, you have to gather information, and you have to consider a lot of different perspectives, okay? So the second thing that you do then is identify what is the ethical dilemma, right? What are the two or more values or principles that are at the heart of this dilemma, and where is that tension? Okay, here you are thinking as well about who's going to be most affected by your decision. This is when you might want to consult your organization's values as well, because if you can't identify the dilemma, you can't say when you go to make the decision, you need to be very clear about what the dilemma was so that you can say, this is the decision I made. If you're just going on a feeling or trying to appease somebody and just make them stop yelling at you, that's not making a rational and a thoughtful and a practical decision, right? So you need to identify the dilemma. Naming it is really important when it comes to reaching a right decision. Next, you're going to explore what are all the different options and consequences. What if what if I did what my knee-jerk reaction was? Okay, what if I took a step back and I did the opposite of that? Who would be affected by what I do? What other options do I have? Do I have to act right away? Can I take some time? Here, you're going to explore what are all the different various options and consequences. You're going to imagine the pros and cons of each of them. You're going to think about what are there legal implications? Are there policy implications? Ultimately, you're looking for the path of least harm, and you're remembering that rarely is nobody harmed in some way. Okay, sometimes it's just our feelings that are harmed. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to make a decision and you're going to test it. Okay, and you might have to test it. It may fail. You may have to go back to one of your other options and test it again. We do this using what is called the CLIck test. Okay, so CLIck is another acronym. And if we think about the first C in CLIck, we are thinking about consequence. And what this means is you're deciding, you have a dilemma, you decided there's 5 possible things I can do. The first one to me seems like the most practical one that I can do. Let me take it through the CLIck test. So you're asking yourself at that first consequence level, what are the consequences of this decision? Who's going to benefit? Who's going to suffer? Okay, and that helps you then to move on to thinking about legal ramifications. Are there legal consequences if I do this? Am I okay with that? And is my organization okay with that? All right. Image, you're going to be thinking about, am I going to be comfortable seeing, what if somebody was to announce this decision or this course of action in a Facebook post or a rant on TikTok or with a video or an Instagram, or somebody was to write an article about it in the newspaper, right? Or it was a feature on the nightly news. How am I going to feel about that? Is it going to be something that hurts or harms our public image or the image of the volunteers that I'm with? This is also something that you need to think about in the CLIck test, where you're testing your decision. Next, you're going to think about culture, right? Does this decision support the culture of your volunteers or your organization, or does it damage your organization's culture and values? Are you okay with that? Are you not okay with that? And if you are or you aren't, it may be an indication of whether this is the right or wrong decision. And lastly, in the CLIck test, you allow a little bit of your own personal feelings to come at play, because that's important in terms of your confidence in communicating your decision. And that's what we call the knot, right? If I was to make this decision, does it cause a knot in my stomach? Right? It's that gut reaction. For others, as I mentioned before, it might be, does it make me break into a sweat? Does it give me hives, right? For me, it's that knot in my stomach, right? So, on a gut level and emotionally, am I okay with this? Would my mentors be okay with this? If I told my spouse about it, would they be supportive of me? Would my kids be proud of me, for example? That's the kinds of questions you're asking us when it comes to the click test. So, you may have a decision that you think is the right one. You take it through the click test, and you're like, actually, when I think about it in these 5 ways, it doesn't sound right. Let me take another one of my options through the click test. And you might do that with all 5 of your options, or you might really quickly come to a decision just by using the click test. And then the last thing that you're going to do is you're going to act, right? So you've gathered information, you have named what the dilemma is, you have explored what a bunch of different various options or consequences are, you've taken them through the click test. By then, you should be feeling, even if it's an upsetting situation, you should be feeling a little more confident, right? And a little bit less like you're reacting from that emotional, personal place. And you can act then with confidence and with courage and with professionalism. Okay. Again, there's no 100% guarantee that you made the right decision, but you're able to, going through this process, justify your actions because you followed this rational process, you followed this thoughtful process, and you took into account all of the contents in that ethical backpack, right? Your personal ethics, your organizational ethics, and your professional ethics. When you are going through making an ethical decision, we have a tool that's on our website, and Sydney will also send it to you. It's our ethical decision making worksheet, and this can help you just to sort of write down what all the different, name who the stakeholders are, name the values that are in conflict, right? So this is the dilemma I'm trying to solve. It'll help you to sort of write down what are all the possible actions and responses that you can take. What would be the positive consequences of those? What would be the negative consequences of those? And if you're thinking about, people always ask me, what do I do with this worksheet, once it's done? What I would say is keep it in your personal files. And if your organization has record keeping standards that require you to also keep a copy in a client file or a volunteer file, do that as well. If you're keeping it in your personal files, just be really sure that you are not betraying anybody's confidence. Names or phone numbers or things like that shouldn't be on this, but it might be something that you go to look at the next time you run into an ethical decision making or an ethical dilemma, and having that worksheet might help to just exercise that muscle and jog your muscle memory of what it's like to go through this process. So let's go back to Lynn, right? If you remember, Lynn is working at a hospital. She's organizing this clinic. Somebody that's senior to her, the VP, says, hey, invite one of our donors. We don't want to disappoint them. And Lynn is doing this clinic for volunteers only. She doesn't know this donor's background. She knows they don't meet the age requirement. She's unsure of their medical background. What should she do? Okay. For many of us, when we read this case study, we have a gut reaction. And if I was to ask each of you today, what is your reaction? Some of you are going to have very practical reactions. Some of you are going to say, I need more information. Some of you are going to say, it's not up to me, it's up to my supervisor. We're all going to react differently. That's our personal ethics at play. That's our lived experience guiding what we would do next. But Lynn went through a really rational process. So let me take you through her process and show you how we use the decision-making process and how we animate it through Lynn's example. So the first thing that Lynn did was gather information, right? She's asking questions like, who's ultimately responsible for vaccines, right? Are there clear guidelines for distribution? Maybe there's something in there that helps to make the decision easier for Lynn because she has to follow a policy or a procedure. She also wants to find out if the vice president has discussed the request with anybody else, right? Is this something that he's trying to do kind of, sketchily and on the sly? Or is this something that he's already got approval from somebody that's higher up, and maybe the decision is not Lynn's to make, right? Lynn's also asking herself, what happens if she prioritizes somebody like a donor based on something other than the established criteria, right? Who benefits, who suffers, what might the consequences be there? She's also naming at this point, who are all the stakeholders involved in this? And for her at this point, she's thinking, the hospital is a stakeholder, the CEO and the board of directors are stakeholders in this because the decision could come back and reflect positively or negatively on them. The volunteers, also community members are stakeholders because at this time in summer of 2021, there were a lot of people waiting to get a vaccine. There were some people who weren't interested in getting it at all. But the community is invested in this as well. And then Lynn identifies herself as a stakeholder as well because she needs to feel confident about the decision that she makes. She identifies the conflict as the core values at the heart of the dilemma being fairness, and she's pulling on those principles of equity and justice, trust, she's thinking about integrity as well, and then also accountability, right? How is the decision that she's going to make going to reflect on the larger volunteer engagement community as well? So for Lynn, she names the main conflict as she's being asked to give preferential treatment to someone based on their financial contributions, not their eligibility. And in doing so, she would be inconsistently applying the rules. So Lynn comes up with 5 possible actions and outcomes. She had more, but for the sake of just this training, here are 5 that she had. She could invite Mrs. Smith to the clinic. Maybe Mrs. Smith gives a large donation afterwards. She could invite Mrs. Smith to the clinic. Maybe Mrs. Smith starts telling other people and word spreads and she starts getting more calls for people who want the vaccine. She can have a conversation with Mrs. Smith. She can say, do you meet this current criteria? If she says yes, she'll say, great, you can be part of this vaccination clinic. She can say, oh, you don't meet the criteria? Sorry, it's not going to happen, right? She can just flat out decline to invite Mrs. Smith because she doesn't meet the criteria. She might, consequence of that might be she makes a colleague angry, a senior colleague angry, and face some consequences there. She could decline to meet Mrs. Smith, but the VP invites her anyway. Okay, so Lynn starts thinking about these possible actions and outcomes. Then she starts taking them all through the click test, right? She starts thinking about what's the consequence of this decision, the legal implications. She's thinking about what would this do for our image? What does this mean in terms of our culture and our organization? How would I feel if I made this decision? So she takes each one of those through that click test, okay? She then decides what she's going to do. She acts with confidence, courage, and professionalism. So in the end, what Lynn decided to do is she decided not to invite Mrs. Smith to the clinic, and she decided to have a conversation with the VP of development. At the time, one of the things Lynn did when she gathered information about at the gathering information stage is she connected with some of her colleagues. One of her colleagues mentioned to her, hey, there's been reports in the media of nurses or pharmacists at the end of a day when there's been a vaccination clinic, they've been calling neighbors or friends or family to use up any of the leftover doses of the vaccine. Their intent is to not let the vaccine go to waste, but the media is portraying them as giving preferential treatment to people that they know, family members, neighbors, friends, for example. You might not want to do this because if this gets out, it may look like you gave Mrs. Smith preferential treatment, which Lynn already identified as the dilemma. So she explained that to the VP, that yes, we have the vaccination clinic, it's not appropriate for us to do that. One of the consequences could be this negative press, and it could really affect our board, our CEO, the hospital, the morale of the volunteers. Because Lynn went through those steps, and was able to gather that information, identify the dilemma, think about all of the possible scenarios, put them through the click test, she's able to communicate her decision to the VP with all of that, right? It's not her just going to him saying, no, I'm not going to do it. It's, no, I'm not going to do it. I've thought about it, and this is why I'm not going to do it. In the end, it worked out really well for Lynn. I know a lot of, some of you here may have been through the same situation and not been able to make the same decision as Lynn, but in the end, it worked out really well for Lynn. The VP was really grateful to her. He hadn't even thought about it. He actually had just gotten a call from Mrs. Smith and was like, let me see if I can get you in. He hadn't thought about the idea of giving her preferential treatment. He hadn't thought it through, right? He was just thinking about appeasing his donor and stewarding her in the right way. So he was really grateful to Lynn, and she ended up having an ally on the senior leadership team who really valued her, saw her as a professional, and that speak on her behalf or speak really highly of her at meetings where she wasn't at, or speak really highly of the integrity of the volunteer program. So that's how everything worked out for Lynn. And it's I know this has been super fast, but that is in essence really like identifying what are what is professional ethics in volunteers, and what are those 5 values and the 3 principles? What is the decision-making process? What is the click test? What is that handout that you can use to take you through the process? And something that, we have to exercise as well as this idea of moral courage, right? Um, it's hard work for us to have to face an ethical dilemma and be the person that makes the decision, right? But we also can't be the profession that passes those decisions on to others, right? If we want to be respected and seen as leaders, we need to have the courage to make those decisions and to act really professionally and confidently as well. Building our moral courage is one way that we can do that instead of flinching or retreating, which sometimes can be our initial reaction. So when you learn the skill and the process of ethical decision making, you build that moral courage, you build that confidence, and it helps you to navigate these things in your daily work. And I'm just sharing a quote here from Rushworth Kidder at the Institute for Global Ethics that says that moral courage is the quality of mind and spirit that enables one to face up to ethical dilemmas and moral wrongdoings firmly and confidently without flinching or retreating. So I want to leave you with some suggestions around how you exercise your ethics. You'll get a handout tomorrow, which is the CCVA values and principles. Pop that somewhere near your desk so it's kind of something that you always look at every once in a while, so that when there's an ethical dilemma there, it's not like you're like, got to dig it out and be like, oh yeah, what are the values and principles again? They're kind of always going to be something that you're looking at or thinking about. I have them up on a wall in my office, so I'm always thinking about them as well. You might want to take the opportunity, if your organization allows, to think about, discuss ethics at staff meetings or volunteer orientations. And if you have other colleagues that you work with who also have a code of ethics, buddy up and do a presentation together on your ethics and how it informs the work that you do. Share that with your colleagues and with the volunteers that you partner with. You might want to use scenarios just like Lynn's as a discussion starter. And if you're looking for more scenarios, we have a lot of them at CCVA. I'm happy to share them with you. And as a team, you might want to use a case study and practice the decision-making process together. One of the things that I find is the most powerful is to find colleagues to serve as a sounding board for you, so that when you find yourself in a situation like this, you have somebody that you can quickly just call up and say, hey, do you have 5 minutes? I want to run something by you. Because we're only ourselves, as we mentioned before, with our own personal ethics and biases. And sometimes running a situation by a colleague can be really powerful to hear from their perspective, or to hear questions that they might have when you say stuff like, what am I missing? What don't I know? Sometimes a colleague can surface things for you that you wouldn't have thought of because they are their own person with their own lived experience, or they may have faced something similar before or know of someone who's faced something similar before. If you don't have someone as your sounding board, I raise my hand and say, I'm happy to be your sounding board. You have my contact information, and people call me all the time with situations, and I'm really happy to help them work through it. It helps me to exercise my ethics as well. There's also some extra resources here that will be in your slides as well. So thank you so much for taking the time today to, either be introduced to ethics or exercise your ethics some more. I did see some faces in the crowd today that have been to this webinar before. So thanks for coming again. And Sydney, I'll turn it over to you now.
Yeah, now's the time we're going to open it up for some Q&A. We did have, we had a what's your email address, which was there on the screen, but if you don't mind putting your email address into the chat box for us, that would be great.
Absolutely.
We had a comment about the Lynn or the Miss Smith situation. Another option could have been to ask Mrs. Smith if she'd like to be a volunteer as well as a donor the next time she is eligible.
That's a great idea. That's a great idea. Yeah, and I feel like probably that was one of the things that Lynn might have thought of, or maybe not, because of just the timing of when that was happening. Yeah.
Wonderful. I know a couple of things that stood out to me, and then we'll kind of open it up for everyone else. Is I'm loving the acronyms. I know it's really it's gonna help me a lot as I'm going through things. CRAFT, especially CLIck, and really the not part of CLIck. I never really I love that there's a personal element to that decision making. That it's not just because of the policies and all this research. Well, we have to make this decision. It's the comfort level for us personally as well as everything else.
Absolutely. It's so important. And it's also, it gives you a little bit of grace in being able to integrate, right, your personal bias for a minute, because sometimes there is something to learn from, um, from our own gut reactions, right, in our own way that we would approach something as well. So it allows you just to tie that in really quickly as well.
Absolutely. And I will say we are probably going to run over a few minutes on time. So I want to respect everyone's time. Thank you again so much, Faiza, for speaking with us. If anyone has to hop off at exactly 3 o'clock, thank you for attending. And hopefully we'll see you next month at the session. But I do, hopefully for all of you who can kind of hang with us for the Q&A, and I have a couple updates myself, if you can hang on for just a few more minutes, that would be great. Nancy Kate, did you have a question? I know that you're off mute. I wasn't sure if you had a question or a comment.
No,
No,
sorry.
okay. No.
This is a new format for me, so I apologize. But and I had another meeting to scoot over, but I will stay for the Q&A and figure out how to mute myself.
No, not a problem. I just wanted to make sure that if you had something to say, that I was going to give you the floor. One other thing that I wrote down, and I was curious if you had any resources for it, Faiza. I need to do my personal